of where we are, so to speak, I think the most interesting way in which you could end this discussion, Professor Putnam, would be by talking about what you regard as the most interesting problem areas of the moment, and therefore, I take it, the most likely growth areas for the immediate future in both of the subjects we've been discussing, philosophy of science and philosophy of mathematics.
Okay, I think that if I'm allowed to confine my prediction to the immediate future, because we know that long-run predictions are always false, but in the immediate future, I would expect philosophy of mathematics to be a growth area and philosophy of logic. I would expect philosophy of physics, I think, to decline somewhat from its central place in philosophy of science, although I think part of it touches philosophy of logic. The astounding suggestion has actually come forward in connection with quantum mechanics that we may have to change our logic, our view of what the true logical laws are, in order to really understand how the world can be quantum mechanical. I think this side of philosophy of quantum mechanics that touches philosophy of logic will be a hot discussion area. But more generally, I think areas which we almost don't think of as philosophy of science that become philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, like these questions about computer models of the mind, computer models of language, and these more general questions about theories of truth, the nature of verification, how science can be objective even though there's not a rigorous scientific method. I think these questions will continue to be the staples of the field.
One thing that worries me about this whole area is its relationship to the educated layman, I mean, which in a sense is the person our discussion has been for. After all, it's now over 70 years since the 25-year-old Einstein published the theory of relativity, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's true to say now that the great majority of educated people with higher educations, university degrees and so on, still have scarcely any idea of what this is all about, and it's done very little to actually influence their view of the world. Isn't there a danger that now science and mathematics are simply racing ahead, and the whole new range and world of insight that is giving us into the universe in which we live simply isn't filtering through to the non-specialist, or not filtering through anything like fast enough?
That is a danger, but it's one that something can be done about. There's now, for example, a text of special relativity called Space-Time Physics, which is designed for the first month of the first freshman college physics course. And the authors say at the beginning that they look forward to the time when it will be taught in high schools.
And do you think that time will in fact come, and quite soon?
I'm sure of it.
Yes, well, I think you're right, and indeed I hope you are. Thank you very much, Professor Putnam.
Thank you.
During the Second World War, there was a strong shared feeling among the Western Allies that what they were fighting for was the freedom of the individual, and that this meant in practice defending liberal democratic institutions. This feeling saturates the only major work of political philosophy to have been written during that war, The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, published in 1945. And for a couple of decades after the war, there was something like a liberal consensus in the Western democracies. So much so that in the Anglo-Saxon world, academics started talking about the end of ideology, as if there were no more political arguments left to have over fundamentals. And in England, a slogan which came to be widely quoted in academic circles was, "Political philosophy is dead." Well, perhaps a reaction against this was inevitable sooner or later. And when it began to show itself in the mid-1960s, it came from both directions, right and left. Conservatives began to feel that in some ways there was now too much freedom for the individual. For instance, as regards sexual permissiveness and pornography and the use of drugs, and a failure to keep down crime, especially crimes of violence. And they felt, too, that a whole generation of young people had now been allowed to grow up in this atmosphere without the restraints of traditional disciplines and punishments, and that the results manifesting themselves were disastrous. Meanwhile, from the far left, many of whose members were among the new so-called permissive generation, liberal democratic regimes were being attacked for entirely different reasons. From that quarter, they were accused of making little serious attempt to redistribute wealth or abolish poverty. The societies over which they presided were said to be class-ridden and racist and sexist. And worst of all, they were held responsible for the unnecessary prolongation of a bestial war in Vietnam. So, debate over fundamentals in politics began again in earnest. And now the debate was about the validity of the very kind of liberal democratic institutions that formerly had been taken for granted. Perhaps because these controversies were at their hottest in the United States, it was there that the chief figures to be thrown up by this new wave of political thought emerged. As far as analytic philosophers working in universities are concerned, far and away the most influential figure to emerge from this situation has been John Rawls, a professor at Harvard, with his book A Theory of Justice. Another much-discussed book is Anarchy, State and Utopia by another Harvard professor, Robert Nozick. If one were to add a third name to this list, it would be that of our protagonist in this program, Ronald Dworkin, also an American and a former professor at Yale, but now resident in England as Professor of Jurisprudence at Oxford. Professor Dworkin's recent book, Taking Rights Seriously, has been met with acclaim which ranges all the way from the severest academic approval to a feature article in Time magazine, which latter I take to be an indication that it's having some influence on popular as well as academic thinking. Professor Dworkin, before I start questioning you specifically about your work and that of your colleagues, is there anything you'd like to add to what I've just said by way of introduction to this program about the historical and social context in which your work has emerged?
Well, I think one or two things are interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, the degree to which many of the social problems in America that you spoke about came out of the racial issue. How many of them had to do with the civil rights movement in the first instance, and then with the special problem caused by extensive welfare programs in cities like New York, which principally helped the blacks, and which were increasingly at the expense of people who formerly thought of themselves as the working classes, the taxi drivers, for example, who began to question premises that were no longer benefiting them, but benefiting people still worse off. There's another dimension to it, I think, that was interesting, and that is this. When the left attacked first the policy in Vietnam and then liberalism generally, they took themselves to be attacking not just a particular political theory, but the whole idea of a rational, well-worked-out political theory in general. So I think you can say that when, for example, Jack Rawls wrote his book, A Theory of Justice, that you have mentioned, it was on the one hand a defense of traditional liberal values. It was also at the same time a defense of the whole idea of using philosophy to support political positions.
What were the academic roots or precursors, so to speak, of this new emergence of political thinking?
I think that the most important development in the academy that directly fed into the rebirth of political philosophy was in economics. Economists had for a long time been concerned in a rather vague way with the whole idea of what makes a society better off. But in the period just after the war, there was a great deal of concern with doing that in a formal way. That is, attempting to give numbers and figures and graphs to say when a society, by virtue of some change that helped some people to the disadvantage of other people, when you could say that nevertheless the society was better off as a whole. The work of Kenneth Arrow was very important in this country, Caldor and Hicks and so forth. So it seems to me the developments in formal economics, welfare theory economics, were very important. In America, particularly, developments in academic law were also important. In this country, it's not generally thought of, the law schools are not generally thought of places where debates of political principle take place, but they are in the United States. One of the reasons for that, of course, is the importance of the Supreme Court in deciding issues of great constitutional principle. And in the period after the war, through the 50s, indeed through the 60s,
great issues of principle were decided by the Supreme Court. For a large part, they had to do with questions about how you could treat accused criminals, for example. But since these questions were decided by courts, they were questions for argument at the level of principle, which took place in law school. And Nozick's book, for example, which you've mentioned, seems to be the print of a legal style of thinking about social questions. So I do think these two developments, economics on the one hand and law on the others, were academic precursors in your phrase.
Yeah. I said earlier that Rawls was far and away the most influential of the analytic philosophers to have emerged from this recent situation. I take it you would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. You see Rawls' name now in so many different contexts. It's hard to read a legal treatise, for example, without seeing him mentioned every time. Talks to the nation, in this country as well as in America, on social policy, questions of welfare. Always the almost obligatory reference now to Rawls. Sometimes in such language as to make me think they don't understand the book, but nevertheless, it's an obligatory reference. Great influence.
Is it possible for you, before we get down to a specific consideration of what he says, to say why he's having this kind of influence?
Yes. I think there are two reasons why. First, something we've just said, that is that he stands not only for a particular theory, but for a majestic demonstration of the power of argument in politics. And I think people are once again attracted to the idea that a sustained argument, which begins with things that are said to be plausibly taken to be first principles, can come down and actually tell us what to do about tort law, about the distribution of milk to school children, or something of that sort. I think that impresses people very much. Secondly, we'll come on to this, no doubt, but I think the conclusions that he reaches have, quite apart from the argument, enormous intuitive appeal to people of goodwill. They're very attractive conclusions.
Well, now let's start considering them. I know this is a very tall order, but is it possible for you to characterize comparatively briefly, I mean, within the context of a television discussion, what it is that Rawls is saying?
Yes, I think for that purpose it would be a good idea to take up two topics in the book. The first is the topic of the method he suggests and employs, and the second, the conclusions he reaches. And I think it's useful to distinguish them because some people are impressed with the one and not the other. The method is arresting, it's intriguing. Rawls tells us that when we're concerned with questions of justice, what rules that could govern the basic structure of a society would be just, that we ought to think about those in the following way. We ought to tell ourselves a fairy story, for a start. We ought to imagine a Congress of men and women who don't belong to any particular society yet, and who come together in a kind of constitutional convention. They're going to agree among themselves on a constitution, how their society is to be run. And they're like everybody else, these people. They have specific identities, specific weaknesses, specific strengths, specific interests. Only thing that makes them different is that they suffer from a total amnesia, the most crippling kind of amnesia. They don't know who they are. They don't know whether they're old or young, men or women, black or white, talented or stupid. In particular, this is very important, they don't know what their own individual moralities are. That is, they don't know, each one has some conception of what he wants his life to be like, what his preferences are in sexual morality and so forth, but no one knows what his views are on those questions. So it's as if, as in Rawls's phrase, they were separated from their own personalities by a veil of ignorance. Now, these amnesiacs nevertheless must agree on a political constitution. Rawls says if we ask ourselves what people in this strange situation would agree upon by way of a constitution, that the answer to that question will be, for that reason, principles of justice.
This is a somewhat far-fetched thing to ask people to assume, isn't it?
Well, it's of course far-fetched to ask them to assume that it ever has happened or could happen.
Yeah.
It's a dramatic way of asking people to imagine themselves making choices in their own self-interest, but without knowing things which separate one person from another. And that's, of course, just a way of enforcing a certain conception of equality on political decisions. But for the moment, I think it's better not to leave behind the myth, because the myth has itself great power. Now, the question is, what would people in this situation agree upon? And that's the second question, namely, the second topic, namely, what conclusions does this method yield? These are two, and Rawls calls them the two principles of justice. They are principles, I should say, for a society with a certain measure of economic development, so that there's enough to feed everyone. Once you reach that point, says Rawls, people in the original position, as he calls this strange situation, would agree on the following two principles. First, everyone shall have, to the greatest degree possible, the basic liberties which Rawls enumerates. These basic liberties are the conventional political liberties, liberty to vote, liberty to speak on political matters, freedom of conscience, They also include freedom to hold personal property, to be protected in your person, not to be arrested suddenly and without due cause and so forth. The conventional, what you might call liberal liberties, are protected in this way. Secondly, the second principle of justice, no inequality in society, in distribution, no difference in wealth, is to be tolerated unless that difference works for the benefit of the worst off group in the society. It's a very dramatic principle, the second principle. It means that if you could change society by making it overall poorer, so the middle class, for instance, was substantially worse off, you should do so if the result of that is to benefit the lowest off group in the society. So you have two principles. The first is the principle that says there are certain liberties that must be protected. The second is the rather more egalitarian principle that says look to the situation of the worst off group. Every change in the social structure should benefit that group. The two principles are related through what Rawls calls the principle of priority. He calls it a lexicographic ordering, and says that the first principle dominates over the second. What that means is that even if, for example, it would benefit the worst off group in the society to abridge political liberties, take away rights of free speech, even if that would benefit the worst off groups in society, you must not do it. Only when liberty has been protected to the full are you entitled to consider the economic questions raised by the second principle. When you do come to those economic considerations, you must benefit the worst off class, but you can't do that until everyone's liberties are sufficiently protected.
And what do you yourself regard as the chief shortcomings of the theory?
I think that Rawls relies too much on rather technical arguments, appealing in a very learned way to recent work in economics about what people in his original position would do. And I think those arguments are to some degree flawed. That is, it doesn't seem to be inevitable that people in his original position would come out with just what he does. I think what's more important, and what I wish he had stressed more, is the deep theory that underlies the use of this device, the sort of thing that you ask for when you say, quite rightly, why should what people decide in this rather strange situation, why should that have to do with justice? So I think it's a weakness that he, as it were, hides the real question, or appears to hide the real question, but I also think that's the great strength of the book. That is, this is the kind of a book in which the usefulness, the importance of the book is not exhausted by the particular arguments it makes. It presents us with an enterprise and says to us, look, if these conclusions are appealing to you, if the idea that we must think about justice by thinking about them through these devices of fairness is at all appealing, why is that so? Doesn't this tell us something about our philosophical capacities? Doesn't it tell us something about our moral capacities that we think this? Doesn't it help to structure how we think about it? Now, it's an enterprise. Rawls' book, one of the reasons why it's so important is that it's launched an enterprise of thinking along these lines, of which he would be the first to say that this book is only the beginning. Each person who reads it will have a different vision of what the enterprise is. I, for one, have a particular way of reading this book that makes it seem more important to me. And that is this. It does seem to me that the great question, the root question for liberalism, by liberalism, of course, I don't mean party politics, and I'm not referring to the Liberal Party as a party in this country. I mean the philosophic doctrine, the philosophic political theory called liberalism. The root question, it seems to me, is this. There are two possible approaches to the question of what is just. What is justice in community? One theory says that the answer to what is justice, what arrangements of goods in society is just, depends upon the answer to a further question, namely, what kinds of lives should men and women lead? What counts as excellence in a human being? One theory says, treat people as excellent people, according to some theory, would wish to be treated. The liberal rejects that notion of justice. He says that justice has a call upon institutions which is independent of any particular notion of what the good life is, but rather can appeal to people as a way of regulating society that can be agreed upon rationally by people who hold very different kinds of theories of, let's say, personal morality. This book is an attempt to show how far an appealing and altruistic and humane political theory can be generated consistent with the basic posture of liberalism on this conception, namely that it's neutral amongst the various personal moralities that people hold. And that's a very important ambition.
Would it be a fair paraphrase of what you've just said to say this, that people both to the left and to the right of liberals differ from liberals in one very important respect, namely this, that both conservatives and people of the radical left tend to regard the individual as predominantly a social animal, and to think that a political theory not only usually does, but should embody within itself a conception of how individuals should live. Whereas the liberal is someone who thinks that how individuals should live is ultimately something for individuals themselves to decide. And therefore you're not looking for a theory of society which itself takes that decision.
Yes.
And
not because, I agree with that, not because the liberal is skeptical, not because the liberal says there is no answer to the question, how should human beings live, but rather because he insists, for a variety of reasons, that the answer must be given for each person, by each person for himself, and that it's the utmost insult to attempt to decide socially that question for individuals.
And one of his criticisms of the conservative or the radical left would be that they assume that it's the same answer for everyone. Whereas part of his belief is that different individuals will have different answers for themselves.
Yes, not because he assumes that different answers are right. He needn't be a relativist.
No.
But just because he insists that it robs people of personality and dignity to answer for them whether they give the right or the wrong answer.
In fact, far from believing that the answers are necessarily right, the real liberal will passionately believe in the right of others to live in ways of which he disapproves.
Yes.
Well,
passionately.
Passionately, as you say. Well, now, this book of Rawls, one very striking thing about it is that it spawned an instant literature, and it was only published in 1971, and already half a dozen years later, there are several other books in print on the library shelves in bookshops about it.
Yes.
Now, this is very remarkable. I can't remember when a whole literature emerged so quickly out of a single book as it's done out of this. You said what you yourself regard as the most interesting or important discussion points in Rawls. Are there any others with which you may not necessarily yourself directly sympathise very strongly, which are nevertheless interesting to large numbers of the other critics or writers about this book?
A large part of the work on Rawls has been, as you indicate, critical. That is, they have pointed out the flaws in the argument that lead from the original position to the conclusion. I described one of the arguments a minute ago, and I said he's assuming that people are all conservative, whereas they might be gamblers. Another part of the literature, and I think more interesting part of the literature, is critical of the conclusions. And this comes from both the right and from the left. The criticism from the right says that it's absurd to suppose that we should be ridden by concern for the worst off group. There are values more important, for example, cultural values, that it's important to perpetuate even if maldistribution or inequitable distribution is the result. Criticism from the left is more complex. It fixes, first of all, on the first of the principles that I offer, and says, Rawls says that when liberty and further equality conflict, liberty is to be preferred. And there are positions on the left which contest this and say that it's a bourgeois, middle-class, liberal view. The second criticism from the left fixes on the second principle. When I described it, I said the second principle said there shall be no inequalities except as benefit the worst off group. A criticism, let us say, from the far left holds that inequalities are bad even if they do benefit the worst off group, so that we should prefer a society of complete equality even if everyone is worse off, including those who would be worst off under a Rawlsian distribution.
That strikes me as being a masochistic view, but it is held by some serious people.
Oh, it is indeed, who make the argument that envy or resentment is itself such a divisive thing that the self-respect, the damage to self-respect that comes from seeing others better off in a social structure is such a malign influence on personality that it's wrong to suppose, in effect, that they can be better off if they're materially better off, but other people are better off still. Yes, it's a view that's very strongly held. I would say of all the criticisms of Rawls, the one most fiercely contested is this seemingly cut off your nose to spite your face view.
Well, I don't think I want to go any further into that. What I'd like to do, Professor Dworkin, is I think you've given, if I may say so, an excellent exposition of Rawls in an almost impossibly short space of time. And I'd like to move on now from Rawls to the other important book that I named apart from your own, namely Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Nozick. I wouldn't ask you to deal with that at such length as we've just discussed Rawls, but I think it's not so important to do so as it hasn't been quite so influential. But could you do, as it were, do more briefly for Nozick what you've just done for Rawls?
I'll try. Nozick starts his argument with remarkable proposition. It's remarkable in its simplicity. Individuals have rights, he says, and there are some things that cannot be done to them without violating their rights. So that's an unexceptional statement. Of course that's so. Then we find out what these rights are. And it turns out that the Nozickian rights have this force, that it is wrong either to injure a person or take away his property for any reason except with his consent, unless to do so is necessary to protect someone else's rights to his property or his person. Now, this means, this is very, very strong, Indeed, it's so strong that one might ask, is it possible to have a state at all that respects that principle? And surprisingly, the first third and the most densely argued part of Nozick's book is presented as a defense of the state itself against the anarchist. Nozick obviously takes this as no mean question, and obviously it isn't. After all, if you take my property away from me, then you've violated my rights. I have a right to take it back. But a state claims a monopoly of the power to use force. The state claims the right to stop me from taking back my property against you. I've got to go to the police and ask them to do it.
It prevents you from taking the law into your own hands,
yes,
as every state must.
Yes, but what it's done is to violate my right, because it stopped me from doing something which I have every right, according to Nozick, to do, namely to protect my own property, which was wrongly taken from me. Nevertheless, Nozick agrees that if everyone did take the law into his own hands, there'd be anarchy. So the question is, what's wrong with anarchy? And his argument here is very elaborate. It may or may not work. There's a considerable doubt about it. But in any event, the upshot of the argument is that there can be a state. There can be what Nozick calls a night watchman state, which means a state that exists simply to protect property and person, punish people on behalf of other people. The question then arises, can the state do any more than that? After all, modern states do a lot more than that. They tax you and me and use the money they get to tax it to help other people or to do things in the common interest. Nozick gives that question a very firm answer. No. The state may not do anything except act as a night watchman. It may not tax, for example, for any purpose other than supporting the police. There are no doubt a lot of people listening who would feel some sympathy with that view. Yeah. And Nozick has been rather popular in certain political circles, for at least this part of his views. Now, what argument could he give for this defense of what he calls the minimal or night watchman state? Well, his argument is this, in large part. Its argument is typically ingenious and complex, but I think the main thrust of it comes to this. He asks us to distinguish between two kinds of theories about what he calls justice in distribution. We each have certain things in society which we own, and the question is that distribution just? Now, says Nozick, one theory is what he calls a historical theory, and that says this. The present holdings are just. What you own, you justly own, provided people gave it to you voluntarily, either as a gift or in return for what you did for them. If, however, it was taken away from anyone else, by taxation, for example, and then given to you, the holding is not just. This, of course, makes holdings, this, of course, would tolerate the most inequitable distribution you can imagine. The second kind of theory, says Nozick, of justice, doesn't appeal just to history, as his does, who gave who to what, but rather offers some general pattern, and says, let us look at how the thing ended up. The simplest form of a patterned theory, as Nozick calls them, is an egalitarian theory. Unless things ended up equal, it's wrong, even if it was all done voluntarily. Now, Nozick says only a patterned theory could oppose his view of the limited power of the state. Because if the state is going to intervene to take money away from some and give it to others, it must be in pursuit of a pattern. Nozick, therefore, wishes to argue that any patterned theory is intolerable. And his argument goes like this. He says, suppose you could collect all the holdings, sweep up everyone's wealth, and distribute it all according to your favorite pattern. Suppose you're an egalitarian, you distribute the same amount to everyone. Now, you turn your back, and people are going to begin trading with one another. Suppose, he says, he uses here the name of a very famous American basketball player called Wilt Chamberlain. He says, suppose Wilt Chamberlain plays basketball extremely well, which he does, and people wish to pay money. He doesn't wish to play basketball, but people give him money, ask him to play basketball. He's going to end up with more money than anybody else. In order to stop that, you are going to have to interfere with liberty to a constant degree. To stop these transactions, stop people from doing what they wish to do, you're going to have a dictatorship. You will not preserve a pattern of justice, if that's what you want, without the most serious inroads on people's freedom. Therefore, you can't have a pattern theory of justice. Therefore, the only tolerable state is his state, namely the night watchman or minimal state.
Well, this seems to be based fundamentally on a concept of the importance of free exchange.
Yes.
Would that be right?
Yes.
That seems to be absolutely the root.
It comes back to this notion of consent.
Yes.
Anytime you lose something, it must be with your consent.
Yes, yes. What would you advance as the chief criticisms of Nozick's theory?
Two. First, that his notion of what basic rights people have, namely this right not to lose their property except with their consent, simply arbitrary. There is some appeal in that right, but there's also plenty of appeal in competing rights, which would have to sanction inroads against it. For example, I see nothing less appealing, just as an intuitive beginning point, with the notion that people have a right to the concern of others when they are in desperate situation themselves. Now, that obviously is going to sanction things being done that Nozick's basic principle wouldn't permit. Nozick has no argument for his basic right, in my view. He simply presents it as a starting point, and therefore it's an arbitrary state. He starts too far along with an arbitrary position. Secondly, I think, as the Wilt Chamberlain argument I gave you, I think well illustrates, his arguments tend to be all or nothing arguments. They're ingenious, but there are many of them of the form, it would obviously be impossible to prevent any exchanges. Therefore, it follows that automatically, if that's a great injustice, a little interference with liberty is also an injustice, possibly a smaller one. And of course that doesn't follow.
And in fact, in American society and British society, we do have the state interfering constantly with these exchanges, but it would be quite untrue to say that this constitutes dictatorship.
Yes, exactly. There's a certain threshold of interference, a threshold of degree and kind. Obviously, taxing a man, taxing Wilt Chamberlain at the end of the year and saying you've got to give back half of what you've earned, is not the kind of interference with liberty that it would be to say no one can pay money to see him play basketball. Those are two different things.
I want finally to come to your own work, Professor Dworkin. How do you, perhaps in the light of the discussion we've had up to this point, how do you relate what you're doing to what Rawls and Nozick are doing?
Well, if you look at it from a certain distance, some people would say great distance, I think we're all working the same street in a way. That is, if you take the conception of liberalism that I offered a few minutes ago, and you very well summarized by saying that the liberal has this view which distinguishes him both from the left and the right, namely that the right way to live must not be a matter of political concern, then each of us, it seems to me, can be seen as in some way protecting or trying to defend that idea of liberalism. But nevertheless, we disagree. I tend, of course, as you will have gathered, I tend to be much closer in sympathy to Rawls than to Nozick. But one way of summarizing the disagreement, it seems to me, would be to pay attention to this supposed conflict between liberty and equality. People make a great deal of this. You might say that Nozick is off on one side. Nozick says liberty is everything. Equality counts for nothing, except as
The accidental result of free transactions, which is extremely unlikely. So liberty is everything, equality counts for nothing. When Rawls puts together his two principles, it looks, at least on the surface, as if he's attempting to make a compromise between the two. That is, he selects certain basic liberties, the political liberties, but he says these do come first. And these do oppose equality. And if equality would be better served by invading them, nevertheless, they must not be evaded. Now, I'm very anxious to contest the whole idea that the rights of the individual that we call liberty are antagonistic to equality. I've tried to stress in my work the degree to which rights of the individual only make sense as the consequence of a very deep kind of egalitarianism. And therefore, I wish, as it were, to change the terms of debate by asking about the claim of right. Is this right necessary to protect equality, rather than by saying how much equality need we give up in order to achieve it? Now, if the program that I thus propose can be carried out, it would seem to me to protect liberalism from an unnecessary position, namely that liberalism somehow is unconcerned with the worst off people in society. Rawls, it seems to me, shows that it needn't be. But I want to go a bit further than that and argue that there is in the motor of liberalism, in that basic conception, there is a drive towards equality, so that at every moment the defense of liberalism is itself a defense.
Would it be an acceptable sort of bold schematism of the three views to say that Nozick goes for, as it were, rights without equality, Rawls goes for equality without rights? What you want to do is to insist that the two can only be even conceptualized in relation to each other, that they are mutually supportive notions.
That third certainly is my view, yes. Yeah. But the whole idea, I want to say that the idea of rights itself is a very problematic idea. It's something that can't be taken for granted. It has to be rooted in something else. After all, you say someone has a right, then in the sense that I think is the most politically powerful, what you're really saying is the general welfare must suffer, if necessary, in order to protect that right. When you take that claim seriously, then it begs for a defense. It's not intuitively defensible. It begs for a defense. Why must the general welfare suffer? Why must the majority lose out to protect, for example, someone's right to speak his mind? And it does seem to me that the only possible defense of rights must lie not in finding some idea of important values which oppose the egalitarian notions embedded in the idea of the general welfare, but something that supports both rights and the notion of the general welfare as part of an overall ideal, namely equality. It's an argument that has to be made out, but if I can just for a moment show the general structure of how that argument would go. Why, for example, do we care about prosperity? Why do we all work so that, now you will say, well, to make people better off, to make the community as a whole better off. Yes, but why is it a good thing to make people better off? Isn't there in the very idea that gains to one can be cancelled, must be set off against disadvantage to other in some sort of balance struck? Isn't that idea only defensible? This, I would argue that it is. If you suppose that the point of it all is to make sure that no one is being favored over anyone else in society. It's often thought that utilitarianism, which is the philosophy of improving the general welfare, somehow pursues, as Bentham is supposed to have said, the idea that pleasure in itself is good. But that seems to me absurd, that pleasure in itself is good. It seems to me that the true defense of concern to improve the general welfare of society, the true defense of that lies in something else that Bentham said. Namely, only in that way can the governors of a society, those in charge, show equal concern and respect for each person. Because what you're saying to each person is, we cannot do this for you because two others would suffer if we did. Something along that line. That is, we cannot prefer you to those two because to do so would be, since you're only one, to show favoritism to you. So it does seem to me that the first shibboleth of political theory that must be struck down is the notion that the general welfare, utilitarianism, is an anti-egalitarian. It's rooted in a certain notion of equality. But when we select political institutions in order to pursue the general welfare, then, because we can only do that, we can only use rough institutions like the marketplace or Parliament or Congress to achieve this, there are certain structural inequalities that result. For example, people who aren't very clever will end up in a worse position. Not because their demands are expensive to satisfy, so it would be showing them favoritism to satisfy, but because a marketplace is going to cheat them because they weren't lucky enough to be born having the qualities other people want. Therefore, redistribution of the result of the market is required, not because it serves some value competitive with the value served by the market, but because only with redistribution can the package, market plus redistribution, fulfill the only justification for having the market in the first place, which is a basically egalitarian justification. Now, I've just taken economic rights as an illustration of how the argument must go, but it does seem to me that we have to supply arguments for these rights and can't take them as primitive.
When you said a moment ago that you and Rawls and Nozick are all, your phrase was, working the same street,
yes.
I think you said something extremely important, because academics, for example, are quite commonly inclined to regard at least Rawls and Nozick as being polar opposites. Whereas, in fact, according to your analysis, what they are both doing, and you also are doing, is defending liberalism. I suppose it would be true to say you're not just producing different defences of liberalism,
yes.
you're also defending different concepts of liberalism,
yes.
but nevertheless that is what you're doing, against attacks from both right and left. One last question I'd like to ask you before we finish this discussion is, what do you regard as the Achilles' heel, so to speak, of this position that all three of you are in? I mean, where are the chief weaknesses of this position that you're all jointly defending?
Yes.
And I suppose arising out of that, the question, where do you think the most important or interesting work is likely to come in this kind of political thinking in the immediate future?
Well, could I just say that though I did say working the same street, I think it is important to emphasize that we're not all defending the same theory. We're all defending theories which make the same claim. That is, the claim to be the consequence of a liberal position. I regard Nozick's work as a challenge, a very important challenge, just because it draws what I think of as malign consequences from the position. So I'm extremely anxious to say that isn't what liberalism is. So in that way, we're opposed to one another, as the orthodox view has it. But if you go back to what I said unites us, namely this notion that political theory, sense of justice, must be distinct from any particular theory about what the good life is, then I think the great weakness, the problem, is to defend against two attacks just at that fundamental point. And the two attacks are, one theoretical and one rather practical. Theoretical attack, which must be met, is this: that the view of liberalism that I've just described rests on a nihilistic or otherwise unattractive or impoverished view of human nature, of what human beings are. You said at one point in our discussion, these opposing views take the position man is social. Well, of course, the liberal doesn't deny that, but the argument is that liberalism is committed to what's often called a Humean or Benthamite or atomistic conception of human nature, which is wrong. Now, we don't have time to go into that, but it does seem to me, first, that it's not true, but absolutely necessary for liberals now to demonstrate that it's not true and to show that the true father of liberalism, if you will, is not Jeremy Bentham, who is in fact rather an embarrassment for liberals, but Kant, whose conception of human nature cannot be called impoverished. Now, the practical problem is this. There are certain things we all want government to do. For example, to select methods of education, to sponsor culture, which on the surface look as if they are endorsing one set of values against another and therefore contradicting liberalism. It does seem to me very important for liberals to develop a theory which would make a distinction here between enriching the choices available to people and enforcing a choice upon people. The crucial idea, it seems to me, is the idea of imagination. The liberal is concerned to expand imagination without imposing any particular choice upon imagination. But I've simply named a problem, Brian. I have it. It does seem to me that liberalism is rather weak at this point and needs a theory of education, a theory of culture support, and so forth. And that, I think, is the answer to the question, where must political theory go? You said just at the beginning of the program that for a long time people had said political philosophy is dead. Well, political philosophy has been born again and is very lively. But what hasn't quite happened yet is the integration, the reintegration of political philosophy into the body of philosophy as a whole. Because, of course, no philosophical problem worth talking about can be pulled apart from the general body of philosophy. And in the two questions I've just named, namely the question of what theory of humanity, what theory of mind is assumed by liberalism, in the question of distinguishing between enriching and constricting imagination. It's plain that political theory must escape what is normally thought to be the boundaries of questions of political institutions or strategy, and must encounter, as all the great philosophers of the past did, the connections between political philosophy and philosophy as just philosophy.
And it's very striking that nearly all the greatest political philosophers of the past, like Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Kant were general philosophers whose political philosophy was just part of their general
So that's the next step.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Dworkin.
Thank you.
Some of the great philosophers have also been great writers in the sense of literary artists. I suppose the outstanding examples are Plato, St. Augustine, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. And if not quite in their class, Descartes, Pascal, Berkeley, Hume, Rousseau were certainly very good writers anyway. And in our own time, Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre have both been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. But on the other hand, some great philosophers have been bad writers, two of the very greatest, Kant and Aristotle, being two of the worst. Quite a few are just pedestrian. One thinks, for instance, of Aquinas or Locke. As for Hegel, his work has become a byword for obscurity, almost a joke in this respect. He must be the most difficult to read of all world-famous writers. What these examples show is that philosophy as such is not a branch of literature. If a philosopher writes well, it's little more than a bonus. It makes him more enticing to study, obviously, but it does nothing to make him a better philosopher. A philosopher could be in the very highest rank of all, like Kant, and still be a lousy writer. I state this firmly at the outset because in this programme we're going to consider some of the areas where philosophy and literature do overlap, not only in the work of philosophers who happen to be great writers, but also in the work of other kinds of writer, poets, playwrights, novelists, who have been directly influenced by philosophical ideas. We have someone here whose experience spans both these worlds. Iris Murdoch is now a novelist of international reputation, but for many years before she became a successful novelist, and indeed for some years after, she was a tutor in philosophy at Oxford University. Iris Murdoch, when you're writing a novel on the one hand and philosophy on the other, are you actually conscious that you're engaged in two radically different kinds of writing? Are you conscious that you're writing differently?
Oh, very much so, yes. These two branches of thought have such different aims and such different styles, and I feel very strongly that one should keep them apart from each other. I mean, that is that when one's writing philosophy, one's writing something which is very much more like science in a way than it's like literature. And literature, of course, has its own rules and its own tricks, and philosophy aims to clarify. In fact, it's essential to philosophy. That should be, in some sense, clarification, and literature is very often mystification, and besides, literature is for fun, literature entertains, literature does many, many things, and philosophy does one thing.
It seems to me, having read many of your books, including your philosophical books, that the actual sentences themselves are different. I mean, what strikes me when I read one of your novels, the sentences are, so to speak, opaque in the sense that there's a lot in them, there's a heavy cargo, there's lots of connotation and allusion and ambiguity and so on. Whereas in your philosophical writing, the sentences are translucent. They're only saying one thing at a time.
Yes, well, I hope this is so, yes. I mean, if, obviously one has a style as a writer, and I certainly have a probably recognisable style as a novelist, but my philosophical style would be something totally different, and I would be very pleased if it was impossible to tell it was the same person writing.
You said something a moment ago that interested me very much. You said that philosophy, I think I remember your words correctly, you said philosophy, the aim of philosophy is to clarify, and the aim of literature is to mystify. And I suppose it's central to what the novelist or the playwright is doing, that he's actually trying to create an illusion, whereas it's central to what the philosopher is doing, that he's trying to dispel illusion, or pierce through illusion, or liberate his and our minds from illusion. Is that an essential part of the difference?
Yes, certainly, and philosophy is to do with getting hold of a problem and holding on to it relentlessly and doggedly, and this is the mark of a philosophical mind, this particular relentlessness, the fact that you stick to your problem.
Yeah. With the making of the contrast in mind, let's deal with these one at a time. I mean, how would you characterise literature as distinct from philosophy in this context?
Well, I don't think one can offer exactly a definition of literature, nor is it necessary in place here.
We know some of the characteristics.
We know what literature is. It's an art form using words, and I would say that literature is art by definition, on the point at which, I mean, one could define it by contrasting it with, say, journalism or something. I dare say great journalism is literature, but there are all sorts of borderlines here. And literature is very, very various. So one thing that strikes one, of course, is that philosophy is very tiny. If you think how small European philosophy is. And
just a small body of work.
Yes, I mean, it's not a vast and multifarious area. No. What strikes one very much, I think, is the way in which the problems which were stated at the beginning are still there, which some people might regard as a proof that one is not making much progress.
Well, the philosopher Whitehead once characterised this rather strikingly, didn't he, by saying that all Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato.
Yes.
And there's a sense in which that is true. And Plato mapped out the territory, and we've all been working in it ever since.
I think the more one studies Plato, the more one sees that this is true, that he raised practically every problem and raised it in a very sophisticated way. Well, literature is vast and multifarious and multiform. It's not, of course, entirely to do with fictions. I mean, there are kinds of literature which aren't on fiction, but
historical writing,
yes,
essays,
reflections of all kinds. Yes. But typical literature, I mean, stories and poems and so on, is fictional. It is to do partly with playing roles. That this is true to some extent of poetry, and I suppose entirely, almost entirely, perhaps one should say, true of the novel. That it's to do with masks and roles and pretending and imagining in that sense, and storytelling. And in this sense, I think literature is very natural. It's very close to ordinary life, and it's.
Well, we all tell stories.
We all tell stories. Yes, I think this is the most natural thing in the world.
Yes.
Telling stories. I mean, one is doing it all the time, possibly without noticing it. If one describes one's day, as it were, one is shaping one's material into a story form. Very often, it's a funny story. Instead, I think it's a very important fact.
There's not many jokes in philosophy.
No, there are witticisms,
yes.
But not exactly jokes. I think jokes would be out of place.
Yes,
and that somehow we live in a literary atmosphere. I mean, we live and breathe literature to some extent, in that when we tell stories or when we write letters and so on, we are making a form out of something which might be formless. And this is one of course, the deep motives for literature or for art of any sort. That one is defeating the formlessness of the world.
One is imposing order on one's
Yes, one is cheering oneself up
environment.
and consoling oneself, and also, of course, instructing oneself by giving a form to something which is perhaps alarmingly formless in its original condition, a sort of rubble, as if we lived in a kind of rubble world, and one's always making forms.
Yes. When you say one's cheering oneself up, I mean, that brings to the fore the fact that one of the essential aims of literature has always been to entertain.
Yes, yes.
And I don't think that has anything whatever to do with the motive of philosophy.
No, I think it may be that philosophy also cheers us up, of course, because philosophy is the imposition of form on the formless in a vast way. But I think this is something which, insofar as the philosopher might be aware of this, it's something that he would be suspicious of in himself, because one's temptation to produce a hasty form or an inappropriate form in order to console oneself. This temptation is one that the philosopher, of course, has to avoid, and I think the good philosopher is always undoing his own work. This is part of the holding on to the problem, being dogged and relentless, which would also, of course, militate against certain kinds of literary devices, because it means that one has to repeat oneself, that philosophy is repetitive, it's coming back over the same ground and breaking the form that you've made. And
you've made a number of points here, especially in your characterization of literature, which by implication contrast with philosophy, but I'd like now to, as it were, draw out the contrasts explicitly. For example, you said just now that, and I think it's a striking fact about storytelling, you said that it's natural and that we all do it and it's part of everyday life, and certainly we all like being told stories. Whereas I suppose by contrast, philosophy is, as it were, counter-natural. I mean, philosophy involves essentially the critical analysis of one's beliefs and the presuppositions of one's beliefs. And it's very striking that people actually don't like having that done to them. None of us do. We don't like being analysed, and we don't like the assumptions on which our beliefs rest being questioned, because it makes us feel insecure and uncomfortable, and we all have a strong resistance to doing it.
Yes, I think it is a very counter-natural, a very unnatural activity. And when one starts doing philosophy, I mean, I notice this, of course, in teaching philosophy, that people are very reluctant to play this game, or cannot see how it's done at all to begin with, because it involves a very odd sort of standpoint. It's notoriously difficult to define philosophy, of course. If somebody doesn't know what this activity is, it's very difficult to say what it is. It's to do with conceptual structures, to do with very deep structures of belief and knowledge, to do with meaning, significance. It's partly, of course, to do with words, in the sense that it's about how language relates to the world and that sort of thing. And it's not science and it's not art, and it's very important that it's not science, I think, don't you think? I mean, that as soon as you start doing science, you're falling right out of philosophy. It's a kind of point of view which, although the style may be scientific, the actual, what you're doing is certainly not science. It's a kind of a reflection on concepts.
Yes. Well, Bertrand Russell once said that it's the questions that we don't know how to answer, and I think Isaiah Berlin and other well-known contemporary philosophers also take this view.
And it means looking at things which one takes for granted and suddenly seeing that they're very, very odd indeed.
Yes. But the one thing that philosophy does have in common with science, I think, is that it's based on an attempt to understand the world and to understand our environment and to understand our situation in a way that doesn't consist just of expressing personal attitudes and personal views. There is an attempt to, as it were, submit oneself, and this was implicit in something you said just now, I think, to submit oneself to criteria outside oneself. In other words, you're trying to say something that is impersonally true.
Yes.
And you said just now, I think, when you were talking about the way you yourself write, you said that, and it's absolutely true, that your novel writing has a very distinctive literary personality, whereas I think you said you wouldn't mind if your philosophical writing was thought not to have any personality. Now, it strikes me that almost the most important thing about an imaginative or creative writer is this possession of a literary personality. If he hasn't got a distinctive personality in that sense, we're not interested in reading it. Whereas with philosophers, it just isn't the case. I mean, you could read all the works of Kant with great care and interest, and at the end of it have no idea what Kant was like as a human being.
Yes, of course, literature is various in this respect, isn't it? That some people have a distinctive style, other people don't. I suppose it is self-expression in a way by definition. I mean, that unless you wanted to express yourself, if you didn't have this motive, you'd lack a very important motive towards this form of art. Whereas philosophy is certainly not self-expression. And philosophy, of course, is argument. And you can say, well, is the conclusion true, or is the argument valid?
I found, when talking to friends of mine who may be very intelligent and very well educated but don't know much about philosophy, I find they often express the assumption that philosophy is a branch of literature, that a philosopher is somehow expressing a personal view of the world in the way that a poet might be or a novelist might be. And it's not always easy to explain briefly why this is not so. I suppose it's partly because these problems, philosophical problems, have histories. And each individual philosopher comes on the scene at some stage in that developing history, and if he makes a contribution at all, it's rather like the scientist. He makes it at that stage. Otherwise, there isn't one to be made, so to speak. Philosophy is the history of philosophy in the sense that there is a development in the problems, and philosophy lives on philosophy very much more than art lives on art. Yes, and I think the writing of art, the writing of novels and poems, engages very much more of the personality both of the writer and the reader, actually, than philosophy does. Philosophy is a much more narrowly intellectual activity. In fact, I'd go farther. I'd say that literature, to be literature at all, must move one emotionally, whereas the philosopher, like the scientist, is actually trying to exclude emotional appeal, isn't he, from his work?
Yes, I mean, literature could be said to be a sort of disciplined technique for arousing certain emotions. That's certainly one of the reasons why one enjoys it. And one of the reasons perhaps why it's both good for us when it's good and bad for us when it's bad.
Well, we've been talking about the differences, and I think it's very important that we should stress these differences, but there are also some things in common, aren't there? I mean, I know from previous conversations with you, for example, that you think that some notion of truth, though they may be different notions of truth, are very near the centre of both.
Yes. I certainly hold a particular view on the subject of what art is like and what literature is like, and this view, which wouldn't be shared by everybody by any means, would assimilate philosophy and literature just in that way. That is, I think that this may be perhaps the only important thing they have in common, but it is important that they're both connected with truth, that they're truth-seeking, truth-revealing activities in some sense, and they're both... I mean, it's always illuminating in a particular thought form to say, well, how is it criticised? What kind of critical vocabulary is directed against it? And I think that the question of truthfulness comes into criticism of literature as well as criticism of philosophy.
Could you say a little more about this? Because I think this is particularly interesting.
Well, that if one thinks of the kinds of things that we say about literature from a critical point of view, we often condemn it for being sentimental or for being fantastic in a bad sense. I mean, let's establish, say, a contrast between imagination and fantasy, with imagination being thought of as a good creative power, and fantasy as a sort of private self-consolation, so that fantasy is bad, imagination is good. I think both philosopher and writer have to face a conflict between imagination and fantasy in themselves. That, of course, philosophy is an imaginative activity, and if one thinks of the great philosophers, they're very often picture makers. They're people who produce enormous metaphors and pictures to explain things. And the intrusion of any kind of personal fantasy is obviously out of place there. But I think it's an even greater a conflict for the writer, because creative imagination and personal fantasy are awfully close in relation to fiction. I mean, the obvious sort of example is the case of the novel, which the bad novel, which turns out to be simply a fantasy of how the hero, who's the writer, triumphs over all his enemies and is loved by the girls and so on, yes, and becomes rich and so forth. And this kind of fantasy is a menace to the creative imagination. And in condemning art for being fantastic in this sense, one's very close to saying that it's untrue, that it's saying something which isn't true.
Now, that conception of truth, though, is different, isn't it, from what the philosopher is trying to get at, is it not?
Well, the philosopher is dealing with truth in a kind of positive sense, in that he's trying to solve certain problems finally. Whether he ever does is another question, but I think there are certain philosophical problems, for instance, about perception, which perhaps have been solved. The writer has a whole lot of aims. I mean, this is what, of course, makes art so interesting, that it satisfies a great many human activities and instincts. It produces happiness in the creator and in the client through doing a whole lot of things at the same time. But one of the things it does, and this is, I think, is important and comes up in philosophical theories about art, which perhaps we might consider in a minute. There is, I think, a mimetic aspect.
What do you mean by mimetic?
That is, that it is imitation of nature, in some sense, that literature is about the world. This might seem to be obvious, but of course it isn't obvious, and since a lot of people would challenge this remark and say that literary art is not mimetic. The same kind of question, of course, can be asked about painting. Music is an odd man out, I think, in this particular discussion, but I think that there are many parallels between painting and literature, and these are sometimes illuminated. You can see something more clearly, perhaps, in the case of painting, which you then can transfer, as it were, to the case of literature.
You suggested just now that we move on to considering philosophical ideas about literature, and I think it would be very interesting to do that. Which of the philosophical views of art that there have been would you pick out as being the most interesting to consider?
I find Plato's very interesting because it raises all the subjects which one wants to clarify one's mind about, when one wants to defend art. I don't know. I think philosophers haven't written very well on art, on the whole, partly because they very often put it in as a minor issue. They've got a general view, say, of morals or metaphysics and so on, and they put in their view of art as a kind of piece that's got to be fitted into the picture, and they don't perhaps consider it too seriously or too generously, or not generously enough.
There is, if I could chip in there is one philosopher whom I would exempt from that charge. I agree that is generally true, but I think Schopenhauer is an exception. I think he is genuinely deep on the subject of art. He, unlike nearly all other philosophers, he did regard art as being central to human life and had some very profound things to say about it.
Yes, this is perfectly true. Yes, I agree with you here. Yes, I think that Kant is very interesting about art. I think his distinction between the sublime and beautiful. Beautiful is purely formal. The sublime is to do with a kind of moral appeal to the emotions, which actually he didn't think of as being art at all. But that distinction, I think, in itself is very informative. But on the whole, philosophers have tended to be polemical about art in a rather fruitless way. I mean, they've tended to produce, and of course any discussion about art tends endlessly to produce again and again a certain sort of either-ors about art, that art's got to be one thing or the other.
Yes, I think this is the trouble with any philosophy of art, isn't it, that it's exclusive. I mean, once you think that all art has got to be of a certain kind to fit in with your particular theory, then it follows from that everything that doesn't fit in with that theory isn't art.
Yes, I think this, fortunately, artists don't pay too much attention to philosophers. They just carry on. But I think philosophy can be damaging to art in the sense. I think the people it damages, of course, are students who long to have theories. I mean, one sees this very often, that young people long to feel that art, too, can be explained, or the aim of art can be explained. I mean, there's these very familiar sorts of fights, or either-ors, that should art be for art's sake, or should it be for society's sake? And this, this is quite interesting, too, because, again, if one's instincts are to reject this choice, which mine are, then to say exactly why can be quite informative.
We've been talking up to this point about philosophy and literature, or philosophical ideas about literature. Let's move on now to philosophy in literature. Let me say what I mean by that. First of all, there have been some famous philosophers, or thinkers very like philosophers, like Voltaire, who've also been major novelists. I mean, not only Voltaire, but also, in our own time, Jean-Paul Sartre. Or among simply famous novelists, there are some who've been obviously very profoundly influenced by certain rather philosophical ideas. I mean, Tolstoy appends to his novel War and Peace a great long epilogue in which he explains that in this novel he's been trying to express a certain philosophy of history. Or if you take another famous Russian novelist, Dostoevsky, he's often described by existentialists as the greatest of all existentialist writers because he's involved in certain kinds of problem that they themselves are also concerned with. Or one can think of a very large number of examples, can't one? I mean, it's obvious that Proust, in À la recherche du temps perdu, is deeply concerned with problems about time, which is also one of the traditional problems that philosophers have been concerned with, and so on. Now, what I would like to get at in the form of a question to you is, what sort of role do you think that philosophy can play in literature? Let us take novels, for example.
Well, I think it had better keep out on the whole. I think that people say these things about writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in order to have something interesting to say about them as well. I mean, obviously, writers are influenced by the climate of ideas of their time, and they're likely to be educated people who know a little bit about philosophical change and so forth. But the amount of philosophy they succeed in expressing in the book is very small. I mean, I think as soon as philosophy gets into a novel, work of literature, it ceases to be philosophy. It becomes something else. It becomes a plaything of the writer, and quite rightly. I mean, a pure novel of ideas. I mean, I don't know that it's very likely that it will. The harder the writer works to present his ideas, the less good his work of art is likely to become. I think it's a very dangerous activity. I think that, again, you see the great 19th century writers get away with quite a lot of idea play in their writings, but if you look at it, you couldn't possibly regard it as philosophy. It's idea play.
Well, I wonder if I agree with you. I mean, you say that people say this kind of thing about philosophers in order to have something interesting to say. Well, no doubt there is a lot of pseudo-talk about novels of this kind. But I did mention, for example, that Tolstoy himself says in War and Peace that this is one of the things he's trying to do. Or take a major English novel like Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. I mean, not only was that directly influenced by Locke's theories about the association of ideas, but there's quite a bit about that in the novel, and in terms which obviously refer to the novel itself. In other words, Stern was quite clearly doing something which he himself related to Locke's theory of the association of ideas. So I think there are, in fact, a number of instances of great novels, I mean, really outstanding novels, where the use of philosophical ideas is part of the structure, is part of what it's about.
Yes, all right. Yes, perhaps it's just that I feel in myself such an absolute horror of putting theories as such into a book. I mean, certain philosophical ideas might... I perhaps put things about philosophy into my novels because I happen to know about philosophy. I mean, if I knew about sailing ships, I'd put sailing ships in. If I knew about hospitals, I'd put hospitals in. And in a way, as a novelist, I'd rather know about sailing ships and hospitals than about philosophy. But I don't think that, the writer necessarily knows...
in fact, you think it's just material?
Well, I think, Tolstoy says this, but I don't. Why should we attend to him? We read his books, don't trust the writer, trust the tale. One has to see what he's actually achieved. And I think that, I can only think of one really good philosophical novel, which is Sartre's La Nausée, which I do admire very much, which might be said to be a philosophical novel, which is demonstrating something about contingency. It's interestingly, it's it's a philosophical subject which is very close to the novelist's thought. I mean, there's a kind of a good marriage there, as it were, between the novelist's thought and the subject.
Well, let's take that, shall we? Jean-Paul Sartre's La Nausée. I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a magnificent book, but surely it also articulates a philosophical theory. In fact, my introduction to existentialism, so to speak, was reading that novel, and I thought that novel actually expressed an existentialist view, and it's rather marvellous. I mean, in the form of a work of fiction. It may well be, as you say, unique, but the fact that it exists at all shows that it can be done, doesn't it?
Yes. You seem to be driving. Say something.
I know.
To say.
Yes, I think there's a genuine difference of opinion between you and me,
yes.
which we simply may not be able to resolve in this discussion. But you, it seems to me, are trying to say that philosophy as such has no place in imaginative writing, except insofar as it can simply be material, like anything else can be material. Whereas I think I want to say that there are really a number of exceptions to this, and that some major novels do make use of philosophical ideas, not just as material in that sense, but in ways which inform the book.
Yes, I mean, this is perhaps just a matter of degree. Obviously, there are things to do with the ideas current at the time, climate of ideas and so on, which give a certain flavour to novels written at a certain time, and incidentally, which make it possible to write in one way at one time and impossible to write in that way at another time. But I think, one speaking rather loosely, I think existentialism may be something of a special case here, because it is a rather literary philosophy. It emphasises all sorts of things to do with the human predicament, and Sartre's marvellous philosophical work, Lettre et Néant, is sort of full of pictures and conversations, as it were. It's true of Hegel, too, actually, that there's an awful lot of amusement and literary stuff, as it were, in both Hegel and in Sartre, and this is interesting. There's something to do with the rather dramatic form of the thought in the philosophy itself, that there's some kind of drama which can be exhibited. There's some kind of feeling about the world which belongs both to the philosophy and to the novel. But one can see that it's not easy from looking at other works by Sartre and by Simone de Beauvoir, where as soon as the existentialist voice comes in, the work of art is rigidified. Yes. I think it was just a lucky chance that he managed to pull it off in La Nausée.
Yes. Well, I think given what you've now just said, I think perhaps we're not so far apart as I thought. Let me raise another